So for our presentation this afternoon, I'm delighted to be able to introduce our speaker. The presentation title, you can see Streamlining Application Rating and Categorization with algorithms. A presentation from Man Group, which is going to be given by James Bashford, who's the technical architect there. James, can I just make sure you're there, ready to go?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. James, I understand that you might have a couple of your colleagues with you. Am I right? Have you got Adam and Lindsay with you too?
Yes, they're going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A and chat panels and repeat any questions to me at the end.
Okay, perfect. Okay, all right. So without any further ado then, welcome to you all. And so without any further ado, if you'd like to begin your presentation, that'd be great.
Great. Okay, so as Peter said, I'm James Bashford, and I'm going to be talking to you about streamlining application rating and categorization using algorithms in ABACUS. So, Man Group, who are we and who am I? Man Group, founded in 1738, we're an active investment management firm focused on delivering attractive performance and client portfolio solutions, deploying the latest technology across our business to help ensure that we stay at the forefront of our evolving industry. Our 5 investment management businesses leverage our robust infrastructure to provide a diverse range of strategies across investment styles and approaches and classes. We continually invest in talent, technology and research as we strive to deliver the best results for our clients. So there's a couple of interesting and relevant points on there. First of all, founded in 1783, 200 years before I was born. We started off as a sugar cooperage, and in 1784 we won quite a lucrative contract to supply rum to the Navy, which, as you can imagine, is in high demand. Probably the more relevant point there is that we have 5 investment management businesses. Now, they've joined us through various acquisitions over the last 20 years, so we're effectively dealing with consolidating 5 technology stacks. And that's led to us having a considerable application footprint of well over 500 applications that you can't manage on a case-by-case basis, so you have to come up with some sort of framework in order to sort the wheat from the chaff. So, who am I? Well, I'm James Bashford, technical architect. I'm in the enterprise architecture team, which is part of trading platform and core technology, and I've held a range of technical positions across a range of companies in the financial sector over the last 13 years. But more importantly, why am I here? So, in the roles I've held in the last 13 years, there's support roles, DevOps roles, deployment specialists. I've been implementing or supporting other people's decisions. I wanted to use my experience to steer implementations to be based on better decisions, and I saw architecture as a role where I could get that exposure. Man Group have been great to me. They allowed me to move from a DevOps role into enterprise architecture, into a newly formed enterprise architecture team. So the concept of enterprise architecture is a new concept at Man. We're currently in the process of trying to get people to think in a sort of enterprise architecture manner. And also I'm new to enterprise architecture by about a year and a half. So I still think in my old methodologies, and sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes it's bad, but we're going to see what I've come up with here. So, key points about rating applications. Why? Why would you want to rate applications? Now, just a key point about why. If you try to do something that you don't understand why you're doing it, you're not likely to do a very good job of it. And if you're in your organization, you're implementing something that nobody can explain why you're doing it, then you probably shouldn't be doing it at all. So why do we want to rate our applications? Well, it gives us a multi-dimensional measure that offers guidance to an application's importance within an organization. Now, what I mean by that is that various stakeholders have various interests in applications. So somebody interested in BCP may be interested in the recovery time objective for an application, whereas somebody in compliance may be interested in what data is held in that application. So by applying the framework I'm going to show you, you'll be able to slice and dice the data to face multiple stakeholders. It shows us where to concentrate our efforts when undertaking risk mitigation, hardening, or rationalization exercises. Because if every time you wanted to say improve your IAM processes, you said, all right, what applications do we have, and started from dot, you'd spend there'd be a lot of wasted effort on figuring out what applications require the level of control you're trying to apply and what don't. And we can demonstrate to clients and regulators an understanding of what control we have on our applications and how our company is operating. And we're an asset management firm, so we manage money for other people. So they often have quite pressing questions about what we're doing in our technology, where our risks lie, and what we're doing to mitigate those risks. So how are we going to achieve all this? So the key is to come up with an objective framework. Simply asking people to rate something will leave you with their opinion of what's important. And so a quick example is you've got application owner A owns a building access application and one that runs the vending machines, for example, and application owner B has a credit card payment system and a general ledger system. Now, what you're going to come out with is that the building access and the credit card payments are both high priority, and the general ledger and the vending machines are both low priority. But how do we know that general ledger is not more important than building access? And which is why we need to come up with an objective framework. So the responses need to be normalized, and we're going to do that by performing an exercise in gathering facts and then applying logic to those facts. And some important notes about best practices and standards. By all means, look into what a standard can do for you and if it fits what you are trying to achieve, but always question its merits before proceeding. Implementing something because it's best practice leads to failed initiatives. Now, for example, we thought we would try to rate our applications by CIA, which is an information security framework, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we probably tried for a couple of weeks to figure out how to rate applications by integrity, and we just couldn't make it fit in a financial institution. Now, if you were somewhere like Facebook, where social media posts fly around the world with eventual consistency, integrity means something there. In a financial institution, everything has to be updated immediately, and all the referential integrity needs to stay intact at all points. So measuring integrity would just mean nothing here. So just a bit of a sidebar about objective frameworks. So what I've come to realise is that all I've done is I've applied the scientific method to a problem of understanding the application landscapes. My education's scientific, a lot of people in ITs is, so I sort of went down this thought path, and it took me stepping back from it to realise I was just applying science. So what am I doing? Or what should you do? Decide what's important to you, break that down into factual data points, decide what each of those data points mean to your model, make your observations or collect your data if you're a scientist, and draw conclusions based on that data. And also a good scientist will then test the conclusions against more data to check that their model makes sense and refine that model. And that's exactly what we've done here. After I went through this process, I then stacked the applications that I believed were important in a catalogue, and then check that against previous reports of what people have thought to be important, just to make sure that there's no major discrepancies. So, how do you get going? So you may already have a perfect CMDB of applications, and you may already know where everything is. This isn't where we started. We'd already done some of the things I'm going to list here, but others we had to catch up with. So the first thing, which sounds odd, is to define application. Now, so if you ask 5 different people in your organization what they mean by an application, or 5 different system holders what they mean, chances are you're going to get 5 different answers. So, for example, do you consider Office 365 to be an application, to be a number of applications? Do you consider a spreadsheet that has tons of customization applied to it to be an application. So you need to make sure you know where the line is before you start this exercise. So an example that this definition we're working to at the moment, a software tool used by IT, the lines of business, external business customers and/or external business partners to accomplish a task or execute a process, also called an app, often the primary technology used to deliver a service to the business. Now you need to know your application, so try and get a deduplicated list of applications. Now, I think I've used about 5 sources to sort of consolidate and figure out exactly what we have. And part of that was normalizing the definition of application and making sure, subcomponents weren't listed and things like that. Make sure each application has an application owner. Now, so we were quite lucky in that this task was performed about a year before we started this, but an application owner can just be someone who has heard of the application and works in IT and has their name next to it, roughly knows what it does. It doesn't have to be an absolute expert, but you can't complete this task without having application owners. And now capture some basic information about the application. So a few high-level fields that you believe are important, and then populate that data set. So we're going to come to our first ABACUS slide here. So you can see a lovely colourful screenshot of ABACUS Enterprise. Now, ABACUS Enterprise is great for these small data collection tasks. So pick your fields, create some charts to tell you your progress, go through and populate them, bring the application owners over or share the dashboards with application owners and say, look, here's your dashboard, just fill this out. It shouldn't be arduous for anyone involved. A few tips on what not to do. Don't try to collect every field imaginable because you will be there for years and you'll probably just fail. Try to avoid free-form text because you're not going to be able to use the data for any high level or calculations or anything like that. Free-form texts are a detail thing, and what we're talking about here is, to take a step away from the detail and let's view the estate as a whole. Don't attempt to collect data you don't have a use for. I've heard a number of times here, oh, wouldn't it be great if we put X in ABACUS? And you always have to ask why, because if you don't have a use for it, all it does is just complicate what you're trying to do, and that data, it's not for free. Even if you've already got the full data set, it still needs to be kept up to date. It still needs to be filtered out, things aren't relevant to it, so there is a cost to maintaining that data. And don't attempt to collect data that you have no source for. So don't try to collect, say, sentiment towards an application if you've never gone through an exercise to collect that, because it's just going to trip up what you're trying to achieve, what you're actually trying to achieve. So what's important to us or for you? Because ultimately it's you who's going to be going through this exercise. We've already gone through it. And so what was important to us is we would base it on 3 attributes. Risk is important at man. So what high-risk activities does the application support? Confidentiality. What sensitive data does the application hold? And availability. What are the recovery point and recovery time objectives? Now, just some key points about risk, and this will be familiar to anybody else in a financial institution, is that you can't actually make any gains or progress without risk, and that sort of goes for life and business in general. A risk-free business is a closed business. So rather than shying away from risk or hiding it or pretending it doesn't exist, risk needs to be managed and not avoided. The key to managing risk is understanding it. And an example of risk in the financial industry would be volatility, for example. Now, with no volatility, nobody in financial services can make any money, but volatility is a measure of risk. Confidentiality. So storing confidential data is a necessity in order to deliver some business activities, but what you need to worry about is the proliferation of sensitive data. So you need to understand where that data is, and you need to understand when that data moves or when that changes. And availability, I imagine most people in IT are familiar with availability. So, just a warning here, try not to base your model on something that can't be measured in some way. So although phrases like integrity or criticality are used when describing IT systems, it's actually quite difficult to define how you would model or measure that. And I've told you before about us trying to model based on integrity. And we also spoke a lot about criticality. Now, people talk about criticality in IT and say what's critical, what's not. But how do you actually define that? And that's not something that we couldn't get to fit. In fact, we could get it to fit, but it looked so much like risk that we ended up going with risk rather than criticality. So, what if you're trying to model something else, something a little bit more interesting? Now, before I dive into this slide, I should probably give you an idea of how its inclusion came about. I was listening to a Stuff You Should Know podcast, and the hosts were describing a situation where an agency overhauled the way they recorded certain data points and drew conclusions from that data. And I realized that a lot of what they were doing there is very similar to what I was doing. It was just a different thing and different data points. And they were doing this nearly 70 years ago. And it's also in here to make sure that you sort of stay awake, because you're probably starting to drift off around about now. So, in the early 1950s, the US Air Force decided to overhaul how they investigated sightings of what at the time were called flying saucers. It was called Project Blue Book, and in a bold move, they decided to use some groundbreaking technology, databases. So back then, they gestured over towards this building and said, look at this database. We can put all of our information about what we're recording in there, and we can use that to draw some conclusions and slice and dice our data. So, the approach they took bore a remarkable resemblance to what we're trying to do here. They approached each witness with a questionnaire and recorded a range of data points to sort sightings into various categories. Had ABACUS been available at the time, then they probably would have modelled their problem in ABACUS something like this. Credibility. Questions to ascertain how credible the witness is. So they ask things like, are you a trained pilot? Were you drunk? A description field, which were, a collection of questions about what the object looked like. So they were asking how fast was it moving? Did it pulse? Was it cigar-shaped? Was it saucer-shaped? Was it square? And a series of questions to ascertain how well the witness would have been able to see the object. So they were asking, was it foggy? Was it raining? Was it nighttime? And then they used this data, they then used the data to ascertain, if it was a credible witness describing something incredible, or if it was something that could easily be mistaken for a weather balloon. If it was in ABACUS, they could have ran some categories, they could have ran some algorithms and sorted it into categories like ignore, misidentification of known objects, or unexplainable phenomena. So back to our stuff. Risk. How do we determine the risk measurement of an application? So the traditional way of doing it is to map all of your business processes, determine each process's risk, determine what applications the processes depend on, combine that with any information regarding alternatives and workarounds, and derive the application risk rating. So that's a hell of a lot of work. And also, the mapping business processes is best done by the business. We're an IT department, so our ability to lean on the business to complete this work is probably, we're probably not going to be able to get it done. So, a more realistic approach would be to identify what activities we consider to be high risk, model those high-risk activities as objects in ABACUS. The application owners can connect their applications to the high-risk activities, and then we can use the information to derive a risk rating for the application. So the advantages to this approach are less upfront work, because you don't have to map every single business process. There's a faster route to displayable value. There's a faster route to a complete data set because you have a rough idea of what all of your high-risk activities are, and you have a rough idea of what all of your applications are. And you only require high-level knowledge to rate this application. So the application owner who knows roughly what the application does and who it belongs to would probably be able to fill out this information. So, confidentiality. So, for data, we'll use much the same method as we do for risk. Identify what types of data we consider to be sensitive, model them as objects in ABACUS, give them all a confidentiality rating, application owners then associate their applications, and the connections can be made to derive a confidentiality rating. Now, in Europe, we've all been through some new regulation called the General Data Protection Regulation, and that's about personal data and how it's suddenly become a lot more sensitive, so we need tabs on where it is and how it's used, along with a lot of other rights that people have to have their data destroyed and whatnot. We went through this process, and a lot of people have said to me, well, we understand all of our data because we went through GDPR. Well, GDPR is, personal data is just a small subset of the data that you hold in the firm, and it's a subset of what's critical as well. There's a lot of data in there, say for instance, profit forecasts are highly sensitive, but they don't come under personal identifiable information. So this is a sort of higher level look than GDPR, but a sort of more complete, holistic look. And availability. So anybody who's ever given any consideration to disaster recovery and business continuity has probably spent some time quantifying recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives for your applications. Here at Man, we already had the following tiered system, and we already had an 80% data set for the applications that we own. So collecting the other 20% made a lot more sense than starting from scratch and trying to model this in some new way. Had this system not already been in place, I probably would have separated out RTO and RPO as separate list properties and worked from there to get a sort of another dimension to what we're looking at. So how does it all look in ABACUS? So let's start with Metamodels and objects. So we started with the Avolution framework 5.2, I believe, and we added a couple of additional objects to it. So application already existed. We've added a data classification object, and we've added a high-risk activity object. Now, they contain more fields than that, but that's what's relevant for what I'm talking about today. High-risk activities, we nested in capabilities, so it can start to build up a business capability map. And then I created a couple of connections to say an application can perform a high-risk activity, and an application contains a type of data classification. Now, if you're not familiar with modifying your meta model in ABACUS, or if you never have, then I believe you're not getting the value out of the system that you could be getting. So talk to the guys there; they're very friendly, and they should be able to help you come to terms with how you may modify this to suit your organisation. Okay, now you need to associate the applications. So the easiest way to do that is to use matrices in Studio. So there's a matrix. I don't know if you can read, but I don't know if you can read this. I don't know if you can read, but I don't know if you can read this. Along the top, we have some high-risk activities, and down the left-hand side, we have some applications. Just double-clicking the cells, that makes that association. Same goes for the data types. Data types along the top, applications down the side. Double-clicking the cell, make that association. Now, unfortunately, this functionality, although you can see matrices in ABACUS Enterprise, you can't edit them at the moment. So the easiest way to do it is to get the application owner over to your desk, just run them through what you're trying to achieve. It also acts for a bit of sort of promotion as to what you're doing, and fill it out with them. This is remarkably fast to do. One of our application owners owns over 40 applications. We got them all rated within an hour. So it's incredibly lightweight once people get into the rhythm of filling this out. Okay, and now you need to populate your recovery tiers. This is just a drop-down list. You can just do that in a catalog. You can see right down the middle there, we've populated some recovery tiers based on the framework I showed earlier. What I've also done is on the right-hand side, I've recorded when if I've completed the data association and classification tasks, and when I completed them. And the reason I've done that is because I'll talk about it in the future, but if we want to change the framework that we're working to, then we're going to need to go out and resurvey people. So we need to know what date we collected the data from them to see if they need to be surveyed again or not. Okay, and then we get onto the algorithms. So we created 3 algorithms to give a final application rating, and we created this with the help of the professional services from Avolution, and it took us about an hour. So it wasn't incredibly, it wasn't hard work at all. We just had to have some idea of how we wanted to do it, and then we got on with it. So we decided to take the maximum data rating, and the reason we wanted to do that is because if your application holds some very sensitive information and some not very sensitive information, you still need to apply controls based on the very sensitive information. So it didn't make sense to sort of try and get a holistic view. All you were interested in was what was most important. So on your screen, you can see the flow diagram that represents the algorithm running. It's all point and click to get it to work. I suppose the only nuance is it sort of worked backwards from how I was expecting it to work. So rather than getting the applications, then getting their data classifications, and then finding the maximum, you actually get the data classifications, pick the fields you want, attribute the max to the source component, and then get the output of that, and then write it into a field. The next one we did was to get the sum of the risk ratings. Now, personally, I believe that partaking in risky activities that doesn't model the same way as a data risk, because you're interested in the sort of surface of the sort of area of risk that you're partaking in, rather than sort of just what's the most important one. So what I decided is that we'd take the risk ratings and we'd sum them to give a risk rating. So get the high risk activities, get the risk rating, attribute that to the source component, get the output, and set the property. Now, the availability tier was just a drop down. So behind that drop down in ABACUS, there's actually an integer associated with it. One point to note is that make sure you've got your drop down ordered in the correct way, because we didn't. So all of our high availability requirements came out with a low rating and vice versa. So we had to change the order of the combo box, of the drop down list. Now, fortunately, ABACUS is smart enough to recognize that when you change the order, you're still interested in the text value that's in there, so we didn't have to go out and recollect all of our availability ratings. And then we want to come up with some sort of total measurement of what's happening here. So what we did was multiply the risk rating, the availability rating, and the criticality tier to give a total rating. And you can see the algorithms there. Get your applications, get the fields, and multiply them. It's all quite straightforward. We've set these up to run twice a day, but you can set them to run a wheel or run, once every hour. It depends how quickly your data's coming in and what sort of response you need to that. Okay, so run the algorithms, sort the data. So here we have a catalog with this is a catalog that you might create to say, look, this is the work that I've done. And you can see there's 3 columns over on the right, where we've got the maximum data risk, the sum of the risk ratings, and the total score. Now, some people may only be concerned with data risk, some people may be concerned with risky activity, some with availability. So this is what I was talking about earlier, saying this is multidimensional. You can filter this and just say, okay, if you're only interested in applications that are critical from an operational standpoint, so need to be available all the time, then you just filter based on the tier. If you're talking to somebody who may be interested in like a total view, well, what's most important, then you sort it based on the column on the right. Now, one point to note, and we've seen quite a few systems just bubble right to the top of this and have vastly higher ratings than everything else. It's not always a bad thing. If you've got a system, if you've got like sort of a holistic in-house system where all risky activities that were done in spreadsheets and done manually have slowly been migrated into that system, it's going to end up with a higher rating. But what's good about that is that you can then say, all right, we'll apply our controls, our most rigorous controls and regulation to that system and prove that to auditors and prove that to your customers. And so you can say, we've handled all of those risky, some of the risk involved in those activities has now been mitigated by a control that we've got over this system. So, some final thoughts and moving forward. So what use is all this? Well, we now have the ability to quickly point to what applications matter to our business and why they matter to our business. And this information can be used to drive further initiatives or regulatory deep dives, prove that we have suitable BCP plans for our most critical applications. Okay, we can do that now. Well, we've not done any BCP planning, but at least we know what our most critical applications are. What critical applications rely on the public internet. I don't know if you saw, but one of the fields we were collecting there were if it uses the public internet or not. Those questions can now be answered just by querying the catalog. So adjusting or expanding the framework, this is something I've already had to do. So when we were going through collecting the data points, we realized that we didn't have certain important types of data listed in there to us. So complete your round of, say, collecting data, then go back through the applications and say, all right, which ones of these would contain these new data points, or which data points need to be clarified? And you can use that information to put an email together to just email out to the application owners. And because it's just a yes, no, do you fall inside this or do you not? You can very quickly recollect that data. If you want to adjust the framework, and this is the beauty of this approach, is because we've not based this on opinion and we've based this on facts, what you can do, for example, is taking GDPR. Now, in 2015, personal data was not considered to be exceptionally important in the UK or Europe. And you look at any sort of scandal from back then, personal data was being shared with other sort of counterparties and being sold. And so the regulation comes in and all of a sudden personal data is very important. Now, had we completed this exercise in 2015, all we would have had to do is change the ratings against the personal data points, rerun the algorithms, and it would have resorted our applications in terms of criticality and what's important to us. So how does it stay up to date? We've floated around various ideas about this. So one of them that my boss is quite keen on is some sort of recertification. Because we put in the date that the data was entered, we can then run an algorithm to say, what has not been updated for 6 months, and you could generate an email off that saying, can you please confirm that you're up to date? What we also want to work on is integrations with other systems. Now, we're in the process of buying an iPaaS system, which is an integration platform as a service. We plan to hook that up to the API that ABACUS has and start integrating things like our BCP software that tracks sort of how business processes will be recovered in a disaster. But that is sort of enriches our processes and our high-risk activity data set that we have. And the honest answer as well to how does it stay up to date is we actually haven't fully worked that out yet. I did like the idea from the presentation earlier today where they said, well, we rely on audit to tell people they need to keep it up to date. That sounds great. So we've got a lot of ideas. We're in a very early stage here. And are there any other uses? So yes, of course, it's ABACUS, so everything can be related to everything else if you know how to manipulate your metamodel in the correct way. So we talked earlier about high-risk activities. So applications can perform high-risk activities, but also people can perform high-risk activities. So in a future exercise, we could hypothetically link people to these high-risk activities, or not people as such, but their teams to high-risk activities. And then we can pick up things like where a team can create payments and authorize payments. And then we can start looking into what we call, or what's called toxic combinations. Where do things you know, where are there conflicts of interest, and this can all be done using ABACUS. Unfortunately now, I need to show a disclaimer to prove that I haven't given you any financial advice. It's the beauty of working in such a highly regulated industry. So if you want to read that, get the recording and pause it, I suppose. And we've reached Q&A. So, Adam, Peter, do you want to take over here?
Well, actually, James, look, firstly, thank you very much for a great presentation. Lots of interesting content there. And I'll return to that in a moment. I do actually have to ask if you can initially, James, can you please stop sharing your screen? We have been experiencing a technical issue while you've been presenting. Everyone's seen everything that you've done. But if you stop sharing, we hope it's going to then free up the Q&A panel. So I just wanted to jump in quickly and ask you to do that. Let's see if we can now rectify the issue. Bear with us a second, please. And I do apologize, everybody. We've had a couple of technical glitches today. The first this morning was with audio. Today's or this afternoon's has been, as I say, in making the Q&A panel available for people to use. Okay, so the Q&A panel is there. We actually do have, I think we've got 2 questions that people have thankfully emailed through to us. So James and your colleagues, you won't be let off the hook that easily. But we are now going to have to ask those people who have questions that haven't been able to enter them before now, please type away furiously. And then James and his colleagues will be able to get to those. So just while that's happening, if I can take a look at the questions that we've already got. Okay, James?
Peter, I think Adam's going to read them out to me if that's, I think he's got them from you now, so.
Cool.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for your questions so far. The first one is, are you able to rate and categorize other aspects of the model? For example, capabilities, projects, risks?
Well, actually, that's a question for you, isn't it, Adam?
I was about to say, yeah, because I've done this. So for projects, we've done kind of exactly the same approach, where we've created some goals. So again, if you ask a project manager or a sponsor, they will all say their project is the most important thing to do in the company right now. By having a list of agreed business goals, we ask people to link their project to those goals, and each of those goals has a priority. Again, we use a similar algorithm in the background to score those, and use that to work out which is kind of the most important set of projects, which are the medium projects, and which are the ones towards the bottom. So absolutely, pretty much anything that you can put in ABACUS, you can model and then run some algorithms in the background around it.
And that is sort of the crux of why I started talking about UFOs halfway through. I'm not like a sort of conspiracy theorist or anything who brings it up at every opportunity. It was a sort of illustration that you can do this to anything.
Yeah, so the second question, I see there's an answer there as well about the no-code algorithms. And I'll jump in the start as well, because I can attest, I was on the call with James. It was an hour, pretty much, end to end. And that was going through with one of the consultants from Avolution, how the Visual Composer works, how you get just the logic in your head to build them. And after that, you know, the screenshots that James shared were exactly taken from the Visual Composer. Everything is drag and drop. So long as you can make the logic in your head work, you draw the components on, run it through to test, save them in the background, and then we just have ours running on the schedule. So, you know, 1, 2, 3 times a day, you get some data updated.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add there. Andrew, I don't know if you want to talk about that and do a bit of sales there.
No, it's a great answer. I think there's a few things I guess we have in terms of what we might classify as like out of the box algorithms as well. So there's a whole bunch of stuff around things like capability maturities or where resources need to be allocated to different projects. Risk is relatively open-ended in terms of it being something like a business or technical risk. But there are various resources that we have, and like you've mentioned already, some key algorithms that you can already build from ABACUS directly. As I mentioned, out of the box ones that address some of those concerns as well. So if you've got specific use cases, feel free to let us know. James and the Man Group here have clearly demonstrated a really good one that we've seen quite a few customers develop as well.
Cool. So the other question we've got at the moment as well is how long did it take for you to get where you are now, and how much effort was involved in maintaining the data?
So actually, that was something I only thought about including about an hour ago, and you've reminded me because I forgot. But the presentation we listened to earlier, they were saying that they had, was it 9 people? And they'd been working on it for about 3.5 years, and they had a very, very impressive metamodel and, well, edging onto digital twin in their company. We only started populating, we were supposed to start populating this in January, and then the business decided to buy some robotic process automation, so I got moved off and had to work on that. So we actually started working on it in May. That was when the initial list went in. That's when we started our what's it called? Yeah. No, Andrew, what's the starter program called that you came in and helped us with? Rapid Start program. So that's when we had our Rapid Start program, and since then we've been working on consolidating the list of applications we have and collecting a basic data set, and then I suppose rating the applications, and we've rated 311 out of 514 at the moment. That's probably only taken a month to 6 weeks. With regard to keeping it up to date, that's something that I mentioned in the last slide. So we have some ideas about how we're going to do it, but we're so early on, we're still populating at the moment. So I suppose watch this space. And I believe that's all the questions.
We're just checking to see if anything else has come in. And it appears not at the moment. So we can ask those people that are on the presentation that or in the session that have any questions, please still feel free to go ahead. We have at least another sort of 10-15 minutes we can certainly take if there are more questions that are going to come in. Maybe just while we're waiting for that, guys, I mean, by the way, and thank you again, the presentation, as I said, that's been really good. And I think actually you were commenting yourself, Adam, there on the, really, I know it's a relatively short amount of time that you've actually spent with the tool, but nevertheless, you've achieved an awful lot, really, so it's all been very impressive. Are there any other experiences, perhaps, that maybe fell outside of the remit of the presentation that you've worked on, but are there any other experiences that you've had, hopefully positive ones, that are worth perhaps commenting on in terms of perhaps even in looking at it from a point of view of the ease with which you were able to get to where you are today, or any other aspects of the way in which you've been using the tool?
Yeah, so for me, I guess there's a huge testament to Man to make the investment in a tool like this. We've also taken the approach to leverage the cloud service that Avolution have. So we had to do very little work to kind of get started with the tool. We have it set up to do integrated authentication, and that was pretty much the only work we had to do ourselves. From that point, ABACUS and Avolution just maintain the service. We connect to it from a cloud-based instance, which made it very quick to establish it, and that Rapid Starter course kind of gave us a really good grounding in how to customize the Metamodel. James has already spoken about, industry standards and best practice are great, but most organizations will need to do some sort of tailoring. I think once we had that as a base, we were then able to start owning the model ourselves, making it relevant to Man, and then when we go and show people some of the dashboards that we've built through the enterprise view, they instantly recognize the terms that we're talking about, the kind of the data that's in there already, and it's a very natural and easy process, again, as James described, around making those connections in the matrix. It's the time it takes you to double click. The users themselves don't really understand, or they don't have to understand what goes on in the background, but we then have a lot of information that's reliably captured, done really, really quickly, that is then rolled up and presented to business and risk stakeholders.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a couple of points I want to sort of talk about, which are at first, let's talk about past plans, because we originally bought ABACUS because it was one of the only enterprise architecture tools that had an API. Now, coming from a DevOps background, me and my boss at the time, we were talking about how we could actually look at every single XE that's running on every single machine and figure out how it's connecting over TCP to other XEs, and we could roll them up into applications and we could model that in ABACUS. And I actually wrote a proof of concept to do that, and it all looked very impressive, and we thought, well, we actually know all of this because we're a sort of very detail-focused organization. But what we hadn't done is sort of step back and collected high-level information. And the more I learnt about ABACUS and the enterprise architecture role that I just sort of started, the more I realized that you're better off with a complete high-level data set than you are with bits of information that don't, like bits of detailed data sets that don't actually join up. So we've sort of come on a journey ourselves about what we're actually trying to achieve, and later on we can dig down into that deeper level. But at the moment, let's get our ducks in a row in terms of what we're actually doing at a high level and what we're, you know, and where we're going and where our risk is and what's important to us. With regards to future uses, we spoke a lot about the data classifications that may have that you saw there. We had 4 tiers. I don't know if you picked it up in the matrix there, but we talk a lot about what 4 tiers would mean, what 3 tiers would mean, and what the effects of that of applying those frameworks are. And for my model, I keep telling people it doesn't actually matter. We can take the facts about what is where, and we can say this is 3 tiers, this is 4 tiers, this is 10 tiers. But you've got the flip side of the coin, is that when you have these data tiers, what you're supposed to do with them is then say, well, if this is restricted / secret, we're supposed to be applying certain we're supposed to be applying certain standards to that, like secret information should be encrypted at rest and should only be accessed by X number of people in the firm, and no developers should have access. So you can, once you come up with those standards, you can see where you've got mismatches, and you can say, well, this says it's got super confidential data in it, but the standard applied, it's in the cloud and it's unencrypted, and we don't even have a handle on who's got access to it. So you can take those situations and make a case for work to rectify those issues. And that's where we can see this going.
That's excellent. Actually, there have been questions, and indeed your colleagues may have seen these. I was trying to determine if you've actually been referring to a couple of these questions as you've answered. And thank you, because you've been talking a lot about your plans for the future. Certainly a question that I've now seen, and for everybody, actually, part of the problem that we've got has continued, but can be resolved by putting questions into the chat window as against the Q&A window. So for anyone that's still hoping to upload a question, please use the chat window. So the question, where do you see MAN moving next in terms of other assessments or ratings across other areas of the business?
Yeah, so I just spoke to that in terms of applying information security policies. Just today, actually, I've been meeting with compliance regarding, we were talking about data retention. Now, in financial services is a really highly regulated industry, and you sometimes have regulation that sort of counteracts or contradicts other regulations. So you may have you've got, say, tax regulations saying you need to hold data for 6 or 7 years, and then you've got GDPR saying you need to destroy data as soon as you don't need it anymore. So previously people used to say, okay, we'll keep this data forever. Now we've got regulation acting in the opposite direction. So what we're thinking about modeling is modeling these regulation, like these data regulation items, and then applying them and linking them to the data points that we have. So this, GDPR applies to personal data, but this personal data is also tax data, so it applies to UK tax regulations. Now, this says that it needs to be kept for at least 7 years, and this says it needs to be destroyed. So match against all the regulations that apply to it, take the longest term, And then if it's got GDPR applied to it, make sure that the longest term is the absolute cutoff for that data to then be destroyed. And then you can use that when you're building in-house applications, you can build your data cleanup processes. But when you're dealing with sort of external parties, you can make sure that that's in the contract that you're signing with them, that they're destroying that data after X number of years.
And as I think you were saying earlier, James, obviously a lot of the future plans that you have revolve around addressing these security issues, if I could call them that. I mean, are there any other sort of examples of either new or upcoming stakeholders that you feel that you'll be supporting as time passes?
Yes, we just at the start with our project management office around collecting data to do with change projects. The beauty we've got in ABACUS, because we now have a very robust list of the applications, we can start modelling the impact the projects may have against an application type. We can also bring in some supplier information to look at how we do due diligence of our suppliers. And actually back to what James talked about earlier is once you've got a rating of an application or a data type, you can join together with the suppliers and you've got kind of that data-driven model. It's no longer a case of, oh, yeah, we think these suppliers support this process. We have it written down, we know it, and we're using a scientific model to drive that.
Also, we have Lindsay here, who's our identity access management expert. So she's going to talk about how we're going to use that in that project.
So a lot of this rating that we're doing with the criticality of applications will be utilised for a lot of our controls for identity access management. So specifically, I know James mentioned it, so we can start to derive some of those critical ratings that the applications have to say which ones are our priorities, so we can start looking at the specific applications we should look at to put into a governance tool. Also segregation of duties, so knowing what our applications do and what our high-risk activities are, we can start to take that. So this will start to drive other processes as well. Hopefully we can integrate the two tools as well in the future.
Does that answer your question, Pete?
Yes, indeed, and thank you. And indeed, Lindsay, I wonder if you've also maybe touched on, there was a question, and can you guys, I think, see the questions, the one that's come in regarding cybersecurity?
Yeah, so does ABACUS support the NIST Cybersecurity framework, and can the system be used to manage the industrial control system architecture and accreditation boundary?
I think that sounds more like an Andrew question, doesn't it?
It's quite a tough one, actually, isn't it?
Thanks, James. I guess it depends on the level of detail. So we've talked, or you guys have talked briefly about regulation structures, if you like, and part of ABACUS would be different phases. So you might want to detail these in complete structure within ABACUS itself. But one of the first things is quite simply just tagging things. So you might tag things that are, ISO 27701 or 2 compliant, GDPR compliant, which things are in scope then for going through some kind of NIST cybersecurity framework. And all of this, I guess, boils down into the level of detail you capture. So if you are capturing low-level system details or integration systems or platforms that you're using, you might want to leverage parts of these frameworks in combination with others. So certainly if you want more information on that, do reach out, because there's a vast array of other cybersecurity frameworks out there and standards like WASP and RASP and various others that you can apply to some of these system integration platforms that you might be using. So ABACUS will certainly help in that area then.
Okay,
cool. Now, I don't think we have any other questions. I mean, one or two did seem to duplicate points that had been made already in the presentation. And as I say, I apologize again that we've had these technical issues. And hopefully, if people did have some thoughts or some questions that maybe earlier on were on the tip of their tongue and would subsequently like to send them in, please do so. And possibly, I think via email might be the best thing at this stage. We can certainly then forward those on to James and his colleagues. In fact, James, could I ask perhaps if you could go back to sharing your screen now? On that last slide, as I think you were on, or certainly the final slide in our, there's a couple of points I can just point you to. There we are. Perfect. Thank you, James. The LinkedIn group that we make reference to there is a location where you can, if you'd like, continue the discussion. So it's an environment where you can just post your comments and hopefully see replies that come in from various people on that. So please feel free to use that. For those of you that have joined us for this session today that aren't existing customers, then, and indeed if you wanted to find out more about ABACUS, then there's a wealth of resources you can download from our website, but you can also download a 30-day trial version of ABACUS, so please feel free to do that. As I say, I think that then brings us towards the end of the time that was allotted. My apologies again that it became a little bit challenging to get the various questions to our guests, but certainly the answers that we received, and indeed the presentation itself was really great. James, Lindsay, Adam, thank you very much for that. As I say, our goal with this event is to actually help other users and perhaps future users to understand just what can be achieved through using ABACUS. And you've given us some great examples of the power that's in the tool through use of algorithms. So thank you very much for that. As I say, any more questions that we get will be forwarded on to you. And for those of you that are hopefully going to be staying around to join other presentations, we actually have one that is starting in 30 minutes. We hope we'll be rectifying technical issues prior to that. I mean, you'll certainly be able to connect. So as I hopefully the Q&A will be working properly for that. This is going to be a masterclass on working with reporting best practice, if you will. So our consulting team in the US are going to be running that session in 30 minutes. That will be followed an hour or two later with a further customer presentation. A healthcare company called MedImpact, who are going to be providing an overview of their business transformation planning work with ABACUS. Now, there are more presentations tomorrow too. So the best thing you can do, I think, is to take a look at our website, or indeed information that we've already sent you via email. You'll see the full agenda items for those tomorrow. So we very much hope you're going to be joining us for some or other of these following presentations. My thanks again to James and the guys at Man. Thank you for that. And so we look forward to seeing you at another presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.